You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 18th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on a packed program today, could Israel and Hamas finally be nearing a deal for a ceasefire? We'll look at why this round of negotiations just might be different than the ones before it. After that, we hear about two world leaders in trouble for very different reasons. First, Justin Trudeau facing calls to resign in Canada.
Thank you all for being here tonight. It's obviously been an eventful day.
Some understatement there from Trudeau. And Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco is here because you have news, Faye, from President Lula.
Absolutely, Chris. Today we discuss how Lula's recent health scares might affect Brazil's next election.
Thank you very much, Faye. We'll also be joined on the show by Monocle's editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, to discuss the 80th anniversary of France's Le Monde newspaper. And finally, a look at tech gadgets just in time to fill out your final Christmas shopping lists. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. The war in Gaza has been at the center of pretty much everything going on in the Middle East over the past year or more than a year. And though the sides have come close to ceasefire deals before, there are some signs that they could actually be nearing the finish line. Well, Michael Binion is foreign affairs specialist and editorial writer for The Times and joins us right here in the studio. Good afternoon, Michael.
Hello, good afternoon.
So I do have to start with this. This is the kind of news that we could have been doing many times over the last few months, frankly. What is your sense of how close we might actually be this time to a ceasefire?
Well, it's very hard to say. Of course, both sides have their own reasons for talking it up, but equally both sides are likely to make an objection at the last minute, which has happened before. I think the idea that William Burns, the CIA director, is expected to go there is a good sign, because he probably wouldn't unless he thought things were getting fairly close. And the host countries, it's been Egypt and Qatar who've been hosting these talks, appear to be quite positive. I think there are reasons pushing both sides to try to get something done before Trump takes office next month.
Well, absolutely, and I did want to talk about that, but before we even get to Trump, I'm just curious what your sense is, I guess, from the two sides when you say whether they want to play up or play down a deal. Obviously, all of this comes down to whether both sides actually want a deal, whether they've had enough of all this, and whether we've reached that point. Is it your sense that we are nearing a point where both Israel and Hamas really feel enough is enough?
I think Hamas certainly feels that. They've lost their leader, who was assassinated by the Israelis. They have also now found that they're pretty unpopular on the ground in Gaza. A lot of people feel that Hamas, by being so intransigent, has actually continued the Israeli campaign, and that this has caused huge suffering, and up to 45,000 people are thought to have been killed, according to Hamas figures. And I think there's a real pressure on the ground there to do some sort of deal. Now, on the Israeli side, it's more nuanced. I mean, the Israeli public would clearly like a deal, and particularly the families of the hostages who are desperate to get them home. Within the cabinet, however, you've got extremists who absolutely don't want a deal at all. They just want victory. In fact, they want, an expansionist Israel. They even want settlers in Gaza. They want, the maximum. And Netanyahu himself, who is already starting a criminal trial on corruption, he is dependent on these right-wing, particularly two of them in the cabinet, for survival of his government. And they are holding up difficulties. They've been a roadblock in the past and could still be objecting to whatever the deal is. They don't think that Hamas is worth negotiating. They just want to smash Hamas.
Now, you did mention William Burns being potentially expected to be in the region. Something that I feel like we've noticed also a few times in the past few months. Joe Biden, as U.S. president, a few times has suggested a deal is close. So there's been this sort of hope on the U.S. side. But as you mentioned, is it a bit different now? Not so much because of Joe Biden, not so much even because of William Burns, but because of Donald Trump.
I think that's a big factor in why both sides think they need to get something done. Trump is more or less, well, we don't actually know what his proposals would be, but he just said it's going to be tough if there's no deal by the time I get into office. In other words, I'm going to be really difficult, I'm going to push people, and the Israelis are hoping he will push Hamas very hard or push the Palestinian side. On the other hand, he could be frustrated and angry if he feels the Israelis are not taking an opportunity that could be there to end this long and bloody conflict. So I think he's sort of suggesting he's going to be really tough one way or the other. And I do think the feeling that Joe Biden actually is of minimal influence now means that nothing can really be done with the American push unless both sides are ready for it. I mean, it's not so much that Washington now has a real chance to get a deal done before the change. I think the chance of getting something done is simply because people don't think that it will be easier when Trump takes office.
This is one of the particularly striking aspects of this, isn't it? The fact that it is the Biden administration that is trying to negotiate this deal, and yet the reason that the two parties might actually come to a deal is because they want one before the next administration is in. I mean, how strange is that in terms of just negotiating style?
It's a real irony. It's an irony. I mean, the present administration is helped by having a very effective and very active Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who's been out there countless times trying to push two sides closer together, and he's still at the heart of all this, and that's important. On the other hand, he is working for an administration that's on its last legs, and with a president who, frankly, doesn't seem very engaged in anything much at the moment. So there's no big stick that Washington can wave. I think it's just they can try to push things along, and I have to say that Egypt and Qatar have done their bit, particularly trying to get Hamas to be more flexible, and there is the real wish, certainly on the Israeli side and possibly even on the Palestinian side, to solve this question of hostages and get them out.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for unpacking some of that. We will continue to follow whether a ceasefire comes in the Middle East or not. That was Michael Binion, Foreign Affairs Specialist for The Times. And now here's Carlotta Ribello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. China's President Xi Jinping is in Macau to celebrate 25 years of Beijing's rule of the region. During his trip, President Xi is expected to continue his call for Macau to diversify its economy away from the casino industry. The first flight since the fall of the Assad regime in Syria has taken off from Damascus airport. A total of 32 passengers, including reporters, were on board. And Honda and Nissan are reportedly in talks to deepen ties as the car giants look to compete with Tesla and their Chinese counterparts. Discussions have included the possibility of a merger, according to sources, that would create the world's third largest auto group by sales. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Carlotta. To Brazil now, where the president, Lula da Silva, has been in hospital for brain surgery after a fall in his home. And while he does seem to be recovering, according to his doctors, questions are starting to be raised about his fitness for office and therefore also possible successors. Well, for more on this, I am joined by Fernando Augusto Pacheco, Monocle's senior correspondent. Faye, good to have you on, as always. How is Lula doing, first of all?
First of all, I have to say he's feeling fine. But it's been a difficult surgery for a brain bleed, which happened after he had a fall in his bathroom a month before. But of course, that left some scars. More sprightly than Joe Biden, I have to add here. But there's been a lot of discussion. And by the way, can I share a very quick anecdote?
Of course.
One of the men that was on the operating team in the surgery, he's the son of the man that arrested Lula during the dictatorship in 1980. So that's quite fascinating. That's something that could only have happened in Brazil.
It is incredible how some of these things come around. Yeah,
absolutely.
You did mention Joe Biden, and of course, this is something that, yes, as an American, we follow this. It does come to my mind. Of course, I mean, maybe there aren't the similarities because Lula has shown himself to be, well, frankly, mentally more fit. But are there nonetheless some questions, given this news, about his physical fitness for office?
There are questions because in Brazil we're already talking about 2026 election. And the problem with Lula is not necessarily just his age, but he didn't left like a successor in a way. We have other names from the left, like Fernando Haddad, our finance minister, or perhaps a younger mayor like João Campos in Recife, but those names will have to be realistic here. When you put them on a poll to Brazilians against a name from the right, it's much harder to win an election. If Lula is the candidate, according to the latest polls, he will still have a very strong chance of winning. But the left, it feels almost static. Lula is back. He managed to beat Bolsonaro by a narrow margin, I have to say. But it's incredible that he's still the only name that can still beat Bolsonaro. There is a problem a little bit with the left in Brazil at the moment.
Well, it is incredible that he's the only person, but I do wonder, and again here, perhaps there are some similarities to Joe Biden and what happened in the United States, not only with, say the Bolsonaro and Trump comparisons, but this idea of if you are on the left, if you are President Lula, you have the limelight, right? You are the one who is in focus. So I guess the question is, what is your sense about, is it something about Lula and his popularity that really leads to the fact that he's the only one who can beat Bolsonaro? Or is it just time for somebody else to find a way to step into the spotlight?
It is both. And in a way, I have to say about Lula, he's always been like this, even in his first 2 terms. He does manage to connect with sectors that the left doesn't traditionally do. So he managed to connect, with the poorest in society. He connects with the agribusiness, which tends to go a little bit more to the right. And I think
he's
the left,
sort of trade unionist and business. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know this as well, Chris. Sometimes the Democrats, they talk to a smaller church, if I may add. And Lula was kind of the opposite of that. But again, we need to talk about his age. He's 79. He had surgeries. It's not the first one. He had other little health problems. Although he's sprightly, I think when he is elected, he's going to be 81, ending his term with 85, 86. So the discussion started in Brazil. We don't know yet what's going to happen, but 2026 could either be another kind of old-fashioned dispute with Lula, or could be completely the opposite, because let's remember, Bolsonaro is also at the moment barred to be a candidate until 2030 by the Supreme Court. Things can change.
Things can change how? What is your expectation also on that Bolsonaro could find a way to get that overturned? Or does he himself have a successor who would kind of hold down the fort for 4 years?
The thing with Bolsonaro, he's got 3 kids involved in politics. He's got senators, MPs.
So many parallels with the US, right?
So many parallels. And his wife, Michelle Bolsonaro, which I have to say, that's a comparison with Melania there. I do think, Michelle probably would be more involved with politics. And they were polling Michelle Bolsonaro. She would be a strong name from the right. Of course, we're just fantasizing at the moment, but honestly, it could become reality.
And just to go back to Lula as well here, Faye, I just wonder if, again, to sort of draw the parallels a bit with what happened in the US, do you get the sense that Lula is somebody who, if there is either pressure or if he realizes that he can no longer do the job, that he would step aside?
I think he would. And let's remember 2010. In Brazil, we can only have 2 terms, but he had the power to change and say, yes, we could add a 3rd term. He didn't do that. I think Lula respects the laws of democracy. He chose Dilma Rousseff as his successor, successfully, right? Because she was elected back in 2010. So I have a feeling that if Lula really deep inside, that he would step down, but it would be a hard decision because, as I said, he is still the strongest name in the left.
Just finally on that then, does he need to see that there is somebody else who could step up? Is that, which again is also what Biden was saying before he stepped down, does he need to see signs of somebody else?
He needs to see signs. There's Fernando Haddad, the finance minister. But one thing I tell you, Chris, in politics, charisma is very, very hard to find.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, Monocle's senior correspondent, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. And to Canada now, where the government of Justin Trudeau is in serious trouble after a devastatingly public resignation of Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. Calls are growing for Trudeau to resign, and here to tell us more is Paul Waldie, Europe correspondent at The Globe and Mail. Paul, great to have you on the show. Just bring us up to speed, first of all. What's the latest? Where do we stand on all of this?
Well, as you mentioned, Chrystia Freeland has been one of Trudeau's long-standing cabinet ministers. She's been in cabinet since he first came to office in 2015, and she has been a loyal trooper for him. But there had been a growing rift between him and her now that she's finance minister over spending plans. She wanted to rein in spending. He wanted to ramp it up. And always lurking in the background was this suggestion that Trudeau wanted to bring Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and former governor of the Bank of England, into the government somehow, into cabinet somehow. So this all kind of came to a head last week when Trudeau basically told Freeland on Zoom that she was going to be dismissed this week after she had to deliver a financial statement, and that Carney was going to take over. So over the weekend, I think she thought things over and decided to resign. She issued a blistering letter, sort of outlining the disagreements she had with Trudeau. And then Carney didn't take up the post. So it kind of left Trudeau hanging, and he had to scramble to fill the position. And in the meantime, Freeland is kind of being hailed across the country as somebody who's finally kind of standing up to Trudeau.
It's interesting the way you sort of unpack that, Paul, because when it comes to the public and her letter, the disagreements that have been cited were particularly about responding to the tariff threat from Donald Trump. I mean, how much of a role did that actually play, or was it more about general spending, as you say?
Well, I think the two go hand in hand. I think it was about a year ago when Freeland said she wanted to hold the deficit, the difference between spending and revenue, on an annual basis. She wanted to keep that to $40 billion because she felt that with Trump coming in and with his threats of tariffs, that is going to put enormous pressure on the Canadian economy. And she didn't want the government to run up a massive deficit. Well, what has happened since then is the deficit has actually climbed up closer to $62 billion, so $20 billion than she said. And she's putting the blame on Trudeau for a lot of that because he's introduced some kind of gimmicky programs, kind of a sales tax holiday for a couple of months. He wants to give everybody $250. She disagreed with both of those. And that's kind of come out in her letter, sort of suggesting that we had to get spending under control, given the threat that Trump poses once he takes office.
And Paul, I mean, Chrystia Freeland has always had a pretty high profile in the administration. She was also Ottawa's lead during the first Trump administration in negotiating with Donald Trump on a renegotiation of the trade pact back then, once known as NAFTA. What is your sense, I guess, of her profile now?
Well, I think there's kind of no doubt that she will now try and run for the leadership of the party should Trudeau resign. I mean, she has a pretty high profile. She will be saddled with an awful lot of the decision-making the government's gone through in the past 10 years. But I think this letter and the fact that she isn't resigning her seat, she plans to run in the next election, all points to her making a leadership bid. There's been rumors about that before when Trudeau's future has been questioned in the past. So I think she's going to try and capitalize on this as much as she can and maybe make a run for the leadership.
Well, and just finally then on that, I mean, when you mentioned that Freeland also still a member of this party, I mean, how much then is the disaffection right now with Trudeau himself, and how much are people ready for a complete change of government?
Oh, it is deep, deep, deep. I mean, the Liberals, even before this, were miles behind in the polls to the Conservative Party. This only amps up the pressure on Trudeau to resign, but he has a minority government, so he is in a real bind in terms of how he resigns without bringing down the whole government with him. But it is a perilous time for the Liberal Party, no doubt about it.
Paul Waldy, Europe correspondent at the Globe and Mail. Thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. And now, when we think about legacy publications around the world, and certain names came to mind, France's Le Monde is certainly one of those at the very top of the list. The newspaper is marking its 80th anniversary today, and to help us celebrate, we're joined now by Monocle's editorial director, Tyler Brûlé. Tyler, good afternoon to D90 in Zurich.
Good afternoon, London.
Tyler, before we get to Le Monde, I do have to ask you, you've been extremely busy over the last few weeks bringing the Christmas spirit to pretty much everyone, subscribers, clients here in London, there in Zurich. How are you holding up?
Well, as our listeners, or at least those who are familiar with my voice, it's rather deep today because this was the penultimate event last night. There was singing involved, so the current space where I'm standing, Chris, our Desiree Bandley transformed it into a bit of a Ginza nightclub as well last night. But anyway, all the carnage is gone. We're back. We're broadcasting. Everything is good.
All the carnage is gone except for a little bit of the remnant in voices and other
Correct.
things. Well, let's look at Le Monde, if we can turn to that, Tyler, because you've been speaking with Le Monde Group's CEO, Louis Dreyfus, and I mean, listeners can hear that interview on this morning's Globalist as well, actually. But I wonder if, given you were speaking to him as well, how does Le Monde think about its own legacy right now?
Well, I think that they are sitting, of course, in the middle of a very interesting France at the moment, because you have a tale of many nations. You have, of course, a Paris and a France, which it's still probably riding a little bit of a high off the back of the Olympics. So there is this, still this sort of sense of success around that. Of course, you have a government which is completely in disarray, and then, of course, in the middle of a week with, of course, one of the biggest natural catastrophes ever seen, off their stretch of the east coast of Africa as well. Of course, the typhoon that hit Mayotte. So here you have a government trying to struggle with that. Of course, it is the lead story if you look at Le Monde at the moment. But yet at the same time, Chris, you have the CAC 40. Of course, you have France Incorporated, and many corners of that still doing incredibly well, despite, of course, the state of the government. And then in the middle of all of that, you have Le Monde, the largest newspaper brand in the country, and one which is also ambitious. I think when we think about a lot of major French players, there's many probably household names that people don't immediately even associate with France, but of course they are very much the cornerstone of France Incorporated. And I would say that Le Monde wants to go a little bit in that direction as well. I think hearing the name Le Monde, it's not going to fool anybody. If it shows up, in print form in Los Angeles, I think everyone will know where it's from. But nevertheless, you're looking at a newspaper which is now looking far beyond the borders of metropolitan France, and of course far beyond the borders, of course, of France's far-flung territories as well.
They are absolutely looking beyond the borders, as you say, not only because of sort of the interest that there is in France at the moment, the way that you outline it, but they're also using that to make an international impact. They have an English language edition now. That's not an easy transition to make. You know that I worked on trying to help a German publication do the same thing in a previous life. I wonder what your sense is of kind of how Le Monde has gone about internationalizing itself.
Well, we're just in stage one of it because you have an English language newsletter. You're looking at, of course, and listen, any international newspaper which is not in your native tongue, many of them, they don't all work at the same level. Some have worked much closer with Google. But if we, where I'm certainly standing now, I mean, NZZ, a newspaper that, of course, we quote a lot, we syndicate from, they have, very, very good translation. And this is obviously automated translation as well. So if you put it through Google, it works incredibly well. And Le Monde is the same. So, of course, you don't have to be, let's say, a paid-up English subscriber to their newsletter. You can also, of course, just go on and read the paper. Of course, you do have to subscribe. They want your subscription. So maybe compared to maybe the days when you were trying things out, of course, Chris, with a German newspaper of record, things, of course, have moved on. The other thing, though, that I would say is that from a consumer perspective, when you think about, of course, Germany has lots of consumer brands, but I would say that there are many more. Certainly, there are many more French brands that kind of get closer to your skin, even applied to skin as well. We're sort of surrounded by the likes of L'Oreal, LVMH brands from Kering, Richemont, etc. So there's this sort of consumer proximity, I would say, as well, that maybe, well, I would sort of say German brands don't have. And I think this also sort of allows, certainly from an advertising perspective as well, maybe for Le Monde to, of course, get a little bit closer to the aspirational international consumer.
Well, just finally, Tyler, then, when you talk about that aspect of this, the moment that France is in, I wonder what that says for you about kind of the Paris media scene in general, which Monocle, of course, has also joined recently with the opening of our new office there. I mean, is this really a moment of interest in France for, as you kind of said at the top, good reasons like the Olympics and fashion, but also some of the bad reasons because of the politics?
Well, of course, it's a news story that keeps on giving, certainly, of course, when we look at French politics at the moment. But I think we're entering a new era, potentially, Chris, when we think about France's role within Europe, France's role within the world. Think back to a time when the Washington Post and the New York Times had their International Herald Tribune joint venture. There is a spirit of an international English language title, which was sitting at the heart of Paris. It was very much informed by a European perspective, written by, of course, a cast of, well, not just Americans, written by a cast of native English speakers who were running that newsroom. Of course, that's changed. The New York Times, of course, who took over the paper. They demobilized more of it in London, more of it elsewhere. But there is this momentum. You get this sense in Paris that this is a place also where we get caught, and we talk about it all the time within Monocle, that you don't want to get caught within the English language news bubble. You don't want to get caught within the Anglosphere. So you think about the power of France, just the sheer number of news channels that the country has, albeit they're all French language, but it's a very, very dynamic scene. Now, if I'm any one of those companies, Chris, I'm thinking about, well, yes, I can speak to Quebec and I can have a little bit of broadcasting into Switzerland and to Belgium and to the French diaspora around the world. But if I'm doing all of this, amazing content, if I've got correspondents right now in Syria, maybe there is more that I can do with that and do more with it in the English language. So I would say quite a dynamic scene. And of course, Le Monde, the big thing that's coming up next, of course, is they're taking their M Le Monde, their amazing weekend supplement, and that is going to go twice yearly now, to start anyway, as a wonderful volume of great stories, great imagery, and I'm sure it's going to be backed, of course, by very good French advertising.
Very interesting things happening at Le Monde on their 80th anniversary. Tyler Brûlé, Monocle's editorial director, thank you very much for joining us from Dufourstrasse 90 in Zurich. This is The Briefing. And finally on today's show, it is time for a roundup of the latest tech, gadgetry, wizardry, and artificial intelligence, as Monocle's technology correspondent David Phelan will explain. Welcome back to Midori House, David.
Thank you.
You have been meeting with Apple's CEO, Tim Cook. That's a good place to start.
Yes. Last week, Tim Cook was in London for a couple of days doing several things. I met him when he was at a youth centre where they were talking about the importance of apps. And also it was on the day of the release of iOS 18.2, the iPhone software, which introduced to the UK and a number of other countries outside the US, artificial intelligence, Apple Intelligence they call it, which is a bunch of new programs and features that you can do on your iPhone, iPad and Mac. And it's fair to say that Tim Cook says it is the future. It's a new era for the iPhone.
It certainly is the future, and I think we talked about this the last time you were on as well, but now that it's here, what is your sense of it, of how it works? I mean, they waited with this compared to maybe some other companies that have launched artificial intelligence earlier. Did they wait for good reason?
I think they just weren't ready. I think they realised they had to do something special, so they partnered with ChatGPT. Now, they never partner with anyone, but now on the iPhone, if you've got the latest phone and the latest software, you can ask a question. If Siri can't find the answer, it will say, would you like me to ask ChatGPT? You don't need an account. It'll answer you 30 questions a day with ChatGPT involved.
It's amazing how much throughput ChatGPT has, isn't it?
Yes, it's extraordinary. And Apple is absolutely at pains to say privacy is not affected. This is, their watchword all the time. They have a thing called Apple Private Compute, and that is what Private Cloud Compute, and that is where your questions go. Other than that, it has a series of quite kind of fun things. I've just, while I was waiting, created, you just say, a giraffe in a tutu under a starry sky, and it creates an image. There's also, you will see an elephant wearing sunglasses. No, I'm not saying those are useful.
I wish our listeners could see these wonderful illustrations that you have designed with your voice.
They're very accomplished, and what's not so good is those two are supposed to be me, and I'm not mad about those, but they're taken from photos in the photo library. But it has more serious functions. You can summarize email chains very effectively. It can create documents for you. But so it is the beginning of something new for sure.
So it sounds like you're also saying there will be more developments on this. This
Absolutely.
is the start, not the finish.
I talked to a number of other executives from Apple last week, and they all say we're in the foothills. We'll be going into Apple Intelligence for the next 20 years. So it's a big thing, I think.
Well, let's move on to some other things because we are nearing the holidays. We're very close now, which does mean you have some gadgets for us, starting with the latest smartwatch.
Yes, this is the Huawei Watch D2, which has you just tap it and it will record your your blood pressure. So it will start in a minute. It's got a special strap, obviously. I'm not supposed to be talking while I do it, but I can now feel the strap.
Your heart rate might be up a little bit.
Yes,
exactly.
exactly.
How tense I'm making you feel, David.
The strap is just gently inflating, like a regular blood pressure cuff, but obviously much more portable. This is the second version.
We don't have to go through the whole blood pressure cuff anymore, which is nice.
No, exactly. That's right. There are rival companies that make similar things, but you have to calibrate them with a regular cuff on a monthly basis. And measurement failed. That's because I'm talking. Anyway, so this just gently inflates, but you can feel it. The first version was a bit clunky. This is much slicker looking, and actually I quite like it.
What's your sense generally of smartwatches these days? Is it a popular thing?
Definitely. I think Apple Watch still leads the field. Samsung is very up there as well, and Fitbit, which is now owned by Google, has a place. I think people are seeing them as the reason they're effective is they're on your body 24 hours a day, or certainly all your working hours. And so if they can take data such as from a heart rate monitor, they can keep on top of how healthy you are, apart from anything else.
Just very quickly, finally, do you have some other gift guides for us? Perhaps you could run through those.
Yeah, I was looking at what's popular, and obviously one of them is AirPods Pro 2. Now, that's been around for a while, but it now, as of the last few weeks, has a thing called hearing test. It can, with your iPhone, it'll check your hearing for you, and in some countries, not in the UK yet, it can work as a proper, authorized, clinically validated hearing aid. So that's
amazing.
A useful thing. If you want something cheap,
am I allowed to say on here that I'll give this to my father? No.
Yeah. There's a British brand called Nothing, which I've talked about a little bit on the program before, and this is the Nothing Ear A earbuds. They're nice because they're a bright yellow. They're really affordable. I think they're £69, but they still have noise cancelling in them, and that's going to be a great stocking filler this Christmas. And then there's other things, but one thing that I have also brought is the Native Union Classic power bank, and it's very neat and little, and you just snap your iPhone onto it. In fact, I've got a feeling if you put the AirPods on them, they may even charge on
right there,
and they will eventually start charging as well. And Native Union, a Parisian brand, is very nice, very stylish, does lots of really cool stuff, and that I think was also a nice stocking filler. There's plenty of other things. The Ember mug is very nice. That's a smart mug. You don't want your coffee to get cold, you see, Chris.
Clearly not. Mine has gotten very cold in the last half hour.
If it were the Ember mug, it sits on a little plinth that keeps it at the exact temperature that you want it at. That's suddenly proving very popular. Therabody, who make fantastic massage guns, they're often quite expensive, but there's one called the Therabody Relief massage gun, which is much more affordable than the others, but also really, really good. I think it's £99 in the UK. There's a lot to be choosing from at Christmas.
Many things out there. Mugs, smartwatches galore. David Phelan, Monocle's technology correspondent, thank you very much for joining us. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riota. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.